The house stood as a monument to decay, a skeletal frame of peeling white paint and splintered, wood slumped at the end of a dirt road that the world seemed to have forgotten. For 12-year-old Leo, the sagging porch and the perpetually grimy windows were not just a home but the entire boundaries of his universe. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something stale and sad, like forgotten memories. Silence was the primary resident, broken only by the creak of floorboards under his small feet or the sharp, impatient tone of his mother's voice. Clara was a woman carved from hardship, her beauty hardened into a permanent mask of dissatisfaction. At 35, her eyes were old, and they watched Leo with an intensity that felt less like love and more like ownership. Their relationship was a distorted mirror of motherhood, reflecting a partnership that was heavy and wrong. Leo felt the weight of it every day, a constant, confusing pressure in his chest. She called him her little man, but the term was a chain, not an endearment. It was the justification for the chores that bowed his narrow shoulders, tasks far beyond the scope of a boy his age. His mornings began not with cartoons or the lazy comfort of a weekend, but with the rasp of a wire brush on the cast-iron stove, his knuckles scraping against the sooty metal until they were raw. Clara would watch from the kitchen table, her coffee cooling as she critiqued his technique, her voice a low monotone that allowed for no argument. Afternoons were for chopping wood, the heavy axe a dangerous weight in his inexperienced hands. He would swing, his entire body straining with the effort, while she hung laundry on the line, her back to him, offering no praise, only expecting the steady thud of the blade meeting the block. The blisters on his palms were simply proof of his duty. In the evenings, the dynamic shifted into something even more unsettling. Clara would pour herself a glass of amber liquid from a bottle she kept in the cupboard, and she would talk to him not as a son, but as a confidant. She spoke of her loneliness, her disappointments, her bitterness towards a world that had left her with nothing but this crumbling house and the boy. Leo would sit on the floor at her feet, tracing the faded patterns on the rug, trying to understand the adult sorrows she poured into his lap. He felt a profound obligation to soothe her, a twisted sense of responsibility that curdled the simple affection a child should feel for a parent. Her need was a vacuum, and he was being pulled into it, his own childhood dissolving into the void. He was obedient, not out of love, but out of a deep, instinctual fear of the consequences of disobedience. A single misplaced word, a moment of hesitation, could cause her face to shut down completely, her eyes turning cold and distant. The threat of her silence was more terrifying than any shout. It was a silence that spoke of abandonment, of being left utterly alone in the vast, whispering emptiness of the house and the fields beyond. So he obeyed. He scrubbed the floors until the water in the bucket was black. He mended fences with clumsy, bleeding fingers. He listened to her woes with a solemnity that aged him by the minute. As dusk settled, painting the dusty windows in shades of purple and gray, Leo would often pause in his work and look out at the overgrown field that separated them from the main road. He would imagine other houses, other boys his age, living lives filled with laughter and light, lives where their mothers hugged them without calculation and their greatest worry was a homework assignment. Then Clara's voice would slice through the twilight, calling him back to a reality that felt like a poorly written play where he'd been given the wrong role. He would turn from the window, the fleeting image of freedom extinguished, and walk back into the dim, oppressive warmth of the broken home, his confusion a heavy cloak around his small, tired frame. The shift was not sudden, but a slow, chilling creep, like the first tendrils of frost claiming a windowpane. The evening rituals had grown longer, Clara's need for his presence more insistent. The line between mother and son, already blurred by her demands, began to dissolve entirely under the weight of a new, suffocating intimacy. It started with her hand lingering on his shoulder for a moment too long, her gaze holding his with an unnerving intensity when she spoke of her loneliness. Leo felt a primal unease, a tremor in his gut that warned of a boundary about to be crossed, though he lacked the vocabulary to name it. That night, after he had finished washing the supper dishes, She did not dismiss him to his own small room at the end of the hall. Instead, she stood in the doorway of her bedroom, backlit by a single weak lamp, her silhouette imposing. She told him she was afraid, that the old house made noises that kept her awake, that the silence was a living thing that whispered terrible thoughts into her ears. Her voice was a fragile thread, laced with a vulnerability that felt practiced, a weaponized sorrow designed to disarm his resistance. She said she needed him close, that a mother should not have to sleep alone in fear, that her little man was the only one who could make her feel safe. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The idea was so alien, so fundamentally wrong, that his mind recoiled. He mumbled something about his own bed, about being just down the hall, but the words withered under her stare. Her face, which had been soft with manufactured fear, hardened. She asked him if he wanted her to be scared, if he enjoyed her suffering. She spoke of sacrifice and duty, twisting the concepts until his refusal would be the ultimate betrayal. The threat of her cold withdrawal, of being cast out from the only anchor he had, however rotten, was more terrifying than the prospect of sharing her bed. Defeated, he nodded, a slow, heavy motion that felt like signing a contract in blood. He changed into his pajamas in the bathroom, the cotton fabric feeling flimsy and inadequate armor. When he returned, she was already in the large, wrought-iron bed, the covers pulled back on his father's side. A side that had been empty for as long as he could remember. The room smelled of her perfume and the faint, medicinal scent of the whiskey she drank. He slid in, keeping to the very edge of the mattress, his body rigid, trying to make himself as small and insignificant as possible. The springs groaned under his weight, a sound of protest that echoed his own inner scream. For a long time, they lay in silence, the only sound their breathing, hers steady and expectant, his shallow and quick. Then her hand found his arm in the darkness, her touch sending a jolt of revulsion through him. Her fingers traced a slow, possessive path from his wrist to his shoulder. He froze, every muscle locked, praying for it to stop. But it didn't. She shifted closer, her body a warm, oppressive presence against his back, her breath hot on his neck. She murmured words that were meant to be comforting, pet names that felt like violations, her arm draping heavily over his side, pulling him against her until there was no space left, until he was engulfed by her. Tears welled in Leo's eyes, hot and shameful. He squeezed them shut, trying to retreat into the darkness behind his eyelids. But there was no escape from the reality of her body against his, from the wrongness of the embrace that was not one of comfort but of ownership. This was not safety. This was a new kind of terror, quiet and intimate and infinitely more damaging than any chore or sharp word. The horror of his situation crashed over him, not as a single wave, but as a slow, drowning realization that the world he knew had been a fragile illusion, and this smothering closeness in the dark was his true existence. He lay there, trapped and motionless, until her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Only then, when he was certain she was unconscious, did he allow the silent sobs to shake his small frame, the tears leaking soundlessly onto the pillow, a desperate private mourning for a childhood that had officially ended in the suffocating darkness of his mother's bed. The new rules were delivered not with a shout, but with a calm, chilling finality that left no room for debate. It happened over a breakfast of cold oatmeal, the gray sludge congealing in their bowls as Clara laid out the framework for their new reality. She looked at Leo, her eyes devoid of their usual simmering anger, replaced by a flat, possessive certainty that was far more frightening. She informed him that things were going to change, that they only had each other in this cruel world, and that their bond needed to be stronger, purer, than that of a mere mother and son. She called it a sacred commitment. Then she said the words that would echo in the hollows of his mind for years to come. From now on, he was to consider himself her husband. Leo's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. The word landed like a physical blow, so absurd and grotesque that his brain refused to process it. He stared at her, waiting for the punchline, for the crack in her facade that would reveal this as another one of her twisted jokes. But her expression remained serene, unervingly devout. She explained it with a twisted logic that spun a web around him. She said a husband protects, provides, and cherishes. He was already doing those things, wasn't he? This was just giving his sacrifices their proper name. It was, she insisted, what God intended for them, two souls against the world. The demands began immediately. He was no longer to call her Mom. The word was forbidden. A relic of a simpler, weaker relationship. Instead, she instructed him to use terms of endearment. Darling, she would prompt, her voice syrupy and expectant. Say, yes, darling. The word felt like ash on his tongue, a blasphemy that choked him. When he hesitated, his face burning with a shame he didn't fully understand, her serenity vanished. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice dropped to a venomous whisper. Did he not love her? Was he ashamed of her? Would he rather be alone, with no one to care for him? She painted a vivid picture of him wandering the fields, hungry and cold, abandoned because he was too selfish to grant her this one simple happiness. His resistance, a feeble spark of instinctual rebellion, was met with the ultimate threat: abandonment. The fear of being left alone in that vast, silent house, of truly having no one, was a weapon she wielded with precision. It crushed his will more effectively than any slap. So he complied. He forced the pet names past his lips, each one a small death of his own identity. Sweetheart, my love, the words tasted of betrayal. The rituals followed. In the evenings, after the chores were done, she instituted what she called their special time. She would make him sit beside her on the couch, their thighs touching, and hold her hand. She would talk about their future together, a fantasy built within the decaying walls of the house, a future where he was fully grown and they would be inseparable. Sometimes, she would make him slow dance with her in the parlor, the scratchy record player warbling an old love song. She would press his small, stiff body against hers, her arms tight around him, humming along as she guided his clumsy steps. He would stare over her shoulder at the faded floral wallpaper, his body a tense, unresponsive instrument in her macabre ballet. These performances were a pantomime of marriage, a grotesque caricature that filled him with a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight in his chest. He was drowning in her need, his own personhood being systematically erased and replaced with the role she had written for him. The confusion of the earlier weeks had crystallized into a clear, sharp agony. This was not love. It was a slow, ritualistic destruction. The shared bed was no longer a shocking violation but a nightly confirmation of his entrapment. Lying beside her in the dark, listening to her breathe, he felt a despair so complete it was beyond tears. He was 12 years old, and he was a prisoner in a marriage to his mother. A union forged not in affection but in isolation and a threat. His childhood a distant memory fading fast in the rearview mirror of her terrifying, twisted love. The school bus was a capsule of normalcy, a rattling yellow machine that carried Leo from one world into another, though the transition was never clean. Each morning, as the bus groaned to a stop at the end of the dirt road, he would climb aboard carrying the scent of that house, dust and despair, like an invisible shroud. The raucous energy of the other children felt like a physical assault after the heavy silence of home. Their shouts and laughter were a foreign language he had forgotten how to speak. He would find a window seat alone, pressing his forehead against the cool glass, watching the decaying house shrink in the distance, a prison receding but never truly left behind. At school, Leo became a ghost haunting the halls of his own life. The boy who had once been quietly engaged, who had occasionally smiled at a friend's joke, had retreated deep within himself. His teachers noticed the change first. The careful, neat handwriting in his assignments degenerated into a frantic, sloppy scrawl, if the assignments were turned in at all. Pages of his textbook would remain unread, the words blurring into meaningless shapes as his mind replayed the previous night's horrors. Clara's whispered demands, the oppressive weight of her in the bed, the feel of her hands claiming him. Algebra equations and historical dates could not compete with the screaming reality of his home life. His grades, once average, began a steep, silent plummet. He withdrew from the fragile social connections he had managed to build. When a classmate invited him to a birthday party, Leo mumbled an excuse about chores, the lie tasting bitter. He ate his lunch alone in the library, hiding between the tall shelves, finding a perverse comfort in the silence that reminded him of the house, but without Clara's penetrating gaze. He watched the other boys from a distance, their easy camaraderie a painful reminder of everything he was missing, everything that was being stolen from him. He was an actor on a stage, playing the part of a seventh grader, but his performance was faltering. The facade was cracking, and the darkness underneath was beginning to show. The bruises were the hardest to conceal. A faint, yellowish mark on his forearm from where Clara had gripped him too tightly during one of her special time dances. A shadow of purple on his bicep, hidden under his t-shirt sleeve, a souvenir from when he had hesitated before calling her darling. He became an expert in the art of concealment, favoring long-sleeved shirts even on warm days, keeping his arms close to his body, moving with a conscious care to avoid attracting attention. But Ms. Albright, his English teacher with kind eyes that missed very little, noticed. She noticed the way he flinched when someone approached him from behind. She noticed the hollows under his eyes, the perpetual exhaustion that no 12-year-old should possess. One afternoon, she asked him to stay after class. The room emptied, leaving the two of them surrounded by posters of Shakespearean quotes and dusty novels. Her voice was soft, laced with genuine concern, as she asked him if everything was all right at home. She gestured gently toward the faint bruise peeking out from under his cuff. Panic, cold and immediate, seized Leo. His heart thudded against his ribs. If he told the truth, what would happen? Clara's threats of abandonment roared in his ears. She would send him away. He would be alone. Or worse, they wouldn't believe him, and the punishment from Clara would be unimaginable. The words formed a desperate, tangled knot in his throat. He forced his face into what he hoped was a convincing expression of sheepishness. He looked at the floor, mumbled a story about falling out of the old oak tree while trying to retrieve a kite. He said he was just tired from staying up too late reading. The lies fell from his lips easily, practiced and polished by a survival instinct that was now his primary guide. Ms. Albright studied him for a long moment, her kind eyes searching his face. He could see the doubt there, the desire to press further, but he also saw his own sheer, animal fear reflected back at him. He held his breath. Finally, she nodded slowly, accepting his fiction with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 100 similar conversations with 100 other silent children. She told him to be more careful and sent him on his way. Walking out of the classroom, Leo felt not relief, but a deeper, more profound isolation. He had successfully protected his secret, but in doing so, he had slammed the door on a potential lifeline. The duality of his existence was now absolute. By day, he was a struggling, withdrawn student. By night, he was a prisoner in a grotesque parody of a marriage. He moved through the rest of the school day like an automaton, the cheerful chaos of the final bell a stark contrast to the heavy dread settling in his stomach. The bus ride home was a journey back into the heart of the darkness, each rotation of the wheels carrying him closer to the woman who called him her husband, and farther away from the boy he was supposed to be. The secret was his to keep, a terrible burden that was bending his spine and extinguishing his light, one lonely day at a time. The twisted sacrament of their nights took on a new, more terrifying dimension, sanctified not by love, but by Clara's warped interpretation of Scripture. She began to quote the Bible, her voice taking on a fervent, preacher-like tone as she isolated passages about unity and becoming one flesh, wrenching them from context to build a divine justification for her depravity. The bedroom, once a place of violation, was now a perverse chapel where she conducted rituals under the dim glow of a single lamp, its light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the sanctity she claimed. Leo's body was no longer just a comfort to her. It had become an instrument in a ceremony he could not comprehend, a physical prayer to a God who seemed to have turned his face away from the decaying house at the end of the road. Her touches, once possessive, became methodical, instructional. She guided his small, trembling hands with a chilling patience, her whispers a blend of religious jargon and grotesque endearments. She spoke of purity within their closed circle, of a love so sacred it had to be protected from the corrupting outside world. Every flinch, every stifled sob from Leo was met not with anger, but with a sigh of pity, as if he were a slow student failing to grasp a fundamental truth. The psychological grip tightened with every passing night. The abuse was no longer just a physical act. It was a systematic reprogramming, an effort to convince him that this was not only normal but holy. The shame he felt was framed as a failure of faith, his revulsion a sin against their special covenant. The pressure built inside Leo until it could no longer be contained. One afternoon, as Clara slept off the effects of her whiskey, a desperate, primal instinct for survival overrode the fear she had so carefully cultivated. He moved through the silent house like a phantom, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He did not pack a bag, he simply ran. He burst out the back door, the screen slamming behind him, and sprinted into the overgrown field, the tall weeds whipping against his legs. The open air felt like a miracle, the vastness of the sky a promise of freedom. He ran toward the distant line of trees that marked the edge of their property, his lungs burning, a single thought screaming in his mind. Away. He didn't make it to the tree line. Clara's voice, sharp as a gunshot, cut through the air. He froze, his body locking in mid-stride, the instinct to obey as powerful as the instinct to flee. She stood on the back porch, her figure silhouetted against the dim light of the house, not yelling, but speaking his name with a calm, terrifying certainty. She told him to come back. She said there was nowhere for him to go, that the world outside was full of monsters who would never understand their love. The fight drained out of him as quickly as it had surged. The vast freedom of the field suddenly felt like an exposed, dangerous emptiness. Defeated, his shoulders slumping, he turned and trudged back toward the house, each step heavier than the last. The punishment was not immediate violence, but something more psychologically devastating. That night, she made him kneel beside the bed as she prayed aloud, thanking God for returning her lost lamb. She then detailed new rules, stricter boundaries. The locks on the doors were checked. His movements were monitored with hawk-like intensity. The abuse that followed was imbued with a new quality, a punitive righteousness, a demonstration of absolute control. It was a lesson seared into his very soul. Escape was an illusion, and disobedience only resulted in a tighter, more suffocating grip. The cycle was complete. The attempt to break free had only served to reinforce his entrapment, proving that the bars of his cage were not made of wood and metal, but of her will and his own conditioned terror. In the following days, a new, insidious fear began to take root in Leo's mind. Seated by Clara's offhand comments about continuing their sacred line, he started to notice the strange symmetry of their features. The same set of the eyes, the same curve of the lip, mirrors of each other in a way that felt deeply unnatural. The implications of inbreeding, a concept he only vaguely understood from biology class, settled over him like a cold fog. His own existence felt cursed, his body not just a site of violation but potentially the product of a similar, hidden horror. The cycle of control was not just present. It was ancestral, a poisoned inheritance that threatened to stretch into a future he could no longer bear to imagine. He was trapped in the present moment of her abuse, and now, he felt the terrifying weight of a corrupted past and a monstrous future closing in on him from all sides. The attic was a kingdom of forgotten things, a landscape of dust and shadows beneath the slanted roof of the old house. Clara had sent him up there to find a particular quilt, a task Leo usually dreaded for the oppressive heat and the feeling of being watched by the ghostly shapes of sheet-covered furniture. But that afternoon, a strange stillness settled over him as he pushed open the pull-down stairs. The air was thick and hot, smelling of ancient wood and decay. Sunlight pierced through a single, grimy circular window, illuminating swirling motes of dust like tiny galaxies. He found the trunk Clara described, but as he lifted the heavy lid, his eyes fell not on a quilt, but on a stack of old photo albums tucked beneath it, hidden away as if they were a secret too heavy to bear. Driven by a curiosity that felt both dangerous and vital, Leo sank onto a dusty crate and pulled the first album onto his lap. The cover was faded velvet, its color bleached by time. He opened it carefully, the brittle pages crackling in the silence. The photographs inside were sepia-toned and curling at the edges, capturing stiff, formal portraits of people he did not know. He turned the pages, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. Then he saw her, a much younger Clara, her face softer, her eyes holding a flicker of the girl she might have once been. She was standing next to a man, his arm draped possessively around her shoulders. Leo's breath caught in his throat. The man was tall and lean, with a sharp jawline and a certain way of holding his head that was unnervingly familiar. But it was the eyes that stopped Leo cold. They were his own eyes. The same shape, the same unusual shade of hazel, the same slight asymmetry that he'd studied in the bathroom mirror. A cold dread, deeper and more profound than any he had felt before, began to seep into his bones. He flipped faster, finding more pictures of the couple. In one, they stood on the porch of this very house, looking younger and, if not happy, at least unburdened. In another, Clara was visibly pregnant, her hand resting on her swollen belly, the man beside her staring not at her, but directly into the camera with an intensity Leo recognized all too well. It was the same look Clara gave him during her special times. A look of ownership. The implications crashed over him wave after terrifying wave. The whispers of inbreeding, the strange familiarity of his own features reflected in his mother's face. It was all here, captured in faded photographs. This man, this ghost with his eyes, was not just a relative. The sickening symmetry suggested something much closer, much darker. He was looking at a blueprint of his own existence, a generational curse captured in silver nitrate and paper. The album fell from his numb hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud that echoed in the silent attic. The truth was no longer an abstract fear. It was a tangible, photographic record hidden in the shadows. He didn't remember climbing down from the attic or walking into the kitchen. He found Clara at the sink, scrubbing a pot. The album was in his hands, a heavy, accusatory weight. He held it out, his arm trembling. He didn't shout or cry. The question came out as a choked whisper, stripped of all pretense. "Who is he?" Clara turned, her eyes flicking from his pale face to the album. For a fraction of a second, he saw a flash of something raw and panicked in her expression, a crack in her armor. Then it was gone, replaced by a fury so immediate and absolute it seemed to suck the air from the room. Her face contorted, her hand snaking out to snatch the album from him. She didn't look at the pictures. She hurled the entire book against the wall, where it exploded in a shower of aged paper and broken binding. "You nosy little bastard!" she screamed, her voice shrill, scraping against the walls. "Snooping through things that don't belong to you." Spittle flew from her lips. She advanced on him, her body trembling with rage. The calm, controlling woman was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. "You think you know something? You know nothing. That is the past. It's dead." Leo stood frozen, paralyzed by the violence of her reaction. It was all the confirmation he needed. Her anger was the truth, louder and clearer than any photograph. She leaned in close, her eyes blazing, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "If you ever go looking for things you shouldn't again, you'll be sorry. You think it's bad now? You have no idea what I can do. No idea what I've already done to keep us safe." The threat hung in the air, more terrifying than any physical blow. It was a promise of deeper darkness, of secrets far worse than the one he had just uncovered. She turned away from him, her shoulders heaving, and began to sweep up the shattered pieces of the album, destroying the evidence of the past with frantic, angry strokes. Leo remained rooted to the spot, the glimpse of truth burning behind his eyes, searing him with the horrifying knowledge that the nightmare of his present was built upon the rotten foundation of a poisoned past. The walls of the house felt thinner now, and he could hear the whispers of generations of silence echoing through the halls. From behind the crisp, flowered curtains of her own tidy bungalow, Mrs. Gable watched the world go by, and the world, for the most part, consisted of the dilapidated house at the end of the road and its 2 inhabitants. At 78, her eyesight was not what it used to be, but her perception was sharpened by decades of quiet observation. She had seen the boy, Leo, grow from a quiet toddler into a withdrawn, skittish shadow of a boy. She had also seen the slow, grim transformation of the house, its decay seeming to mirror the fading light in the child's eyes. Lately, her observations had curdled into a deep, nagging unease. It was the sounds that first snagged her attention. The old houses on the lane were not well insulated, and on still nights, voices carried. The arguments were not the normal, heated exchanges between a mother and a teenage son. There were no shouted words about curfews or grades. Instead, Mrs. Gable would hear the low, relentless drone of Clara's voice, a sound like wasps buzzing behind a wall, followed by long stretches of a silence that felt heavier, more menacing, than any shout. Sometimes, she heard the boy crying. Not the tempestuous sobs of youth, but a muffled, desperate weeping that was quickly stifled, as if he were pressing his face into a pillow to smother the sound. She began to mark these occurrences in her mind, a silent ledger of disquiet. Her concerns solidified when she saw Leo himself. She'd watch him trudge down the dirt road to meet the school bus, his shoulders perpetually hunched, his head bowed as if against a constant wind. One afternoon, she was tending her rose bushes when he passed by, close enough for her to see the purple smudges of exhaustion under his eyes and a fresh, livid scratch on his cheek. He moved with a weary, shuffling gait that belonged to a man 3 times his age. When she called out a gentle hello, he started violently, his eyes wide with a fear that was far too immediate for a simple greeting. He mumbled something incoherent and practically ran the rest of the way home. The compulsion to act, a duty forged in her own years of motherhood, grew too strong to ignore. She decided on a direct, neighborly approach. Baking a batch of her famous oatmeal cookies, she carried the warm plate across the road one Tuesday afternoon, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She knocked on the peeling door, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet yard. The door swung open not with a welcoming creak, but with a swift, jarring motion. Clara stood there, blocking the doorway, her body a barrier. She offered a smile, but it was a tight, thin-lipped expression that never reached her eyes, which were sharp and assessing. "Why, Agnes, what a surprise!" Clara said, her voice dripping with a false, cloying sweetness. She made no move to invite her in. Mrs. Gable held out the plate. "I just baked a few too many cookies. Thought you and Leo might enjoy them." She tried to peer past Clara's shoulder into the dim interior of the house. "How is the boy? I saw him the other day, and he looked a bit peaky." Clara's smile didn't waver, but a new, calculating light entered her gaze. She took the plate with a gracious nod. "That's so kind of you. It's just, well, it's been a difficult time." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Leo hasn't been well. It's a private matter, you understand. A neurological condition. The doctors are still running tests. Causes him to be erratic. He has terrible nightmares, sleepwalks. Sometimes he doesn't even know what he's saying or doing. It's why we have to keep things so quiet." The lie was delivered with such smooth, practiced conviction that Mrs. Gable was momentarily stunned. A neurological condition. It sounded medical, official, a perfect shield against prying eyes. It explained the boy's exhaustion, his jumpiness, even the scratches. He could have done them to himself in a confused state. "Oh, I had no idea," Mrs. Gable stammered, her certainty faltering. "Is there anything I can do?" "Just your prayers," Clara said, her voice thick with manufactured sorrow. "And it's best if we're not disturbed. The stress aggravates his condition. You understand, it wasn't a question. It was a dismissal." Clara took a half-step back, the door already beginning to close. "Thank you for the cookies, Agnes," and with that, the door clicked shut, leaving Mrs. Gable standing alone on the porch, the plate of cookies now feeling like a bribe she had foolishly offered at the gates of a fortress. She walked back to her house, the unease in her stomach now churning with frustration and a healthy dose of doubt. Clara's story was plausible, neatly packaged to explain away every alarming observation. Yet something felt deeply wrong. The woman's eyes had been too cold, her demeanor too controlled. It was the performance of a grieving mother, not the reality of one. Mrs. Gable returned to her window, the familiar view now tainted. She had tried to reach out, to throw a lifeline, but Clara had intercepted it, spinning it into another strand of the web that isolated the boy. The outside world's attempt to help had been rendered futile, adding a new layer of tension to the quiet lane. The tension of a truth being deliberately, skillfully concealed behind a curtain of lies. The violence of the night was a fresh brand on his soul, a new depth of horror that made all that had come before seem like a prelude. It had started with a refusal, a single, choked no, when Clara had demanded he recite the twisted vows she had written for them. The word had hung in the air, a tiny act of defiance that shattered the fragile equilibrium of their nightmare. Her reaction was not the cold withdrawal he feared, but a scalding, physical fury. Her hands, usually instruments of possessive control, became weapons. The sting of her palm against his face, the brutal grip on his arms as she shook him, the things she forced his body to do afterward. It was all a storm of pain and degradation that left him hollowed out and trembling long after she had fallen into a whiskey-soaked sleep beside him. Lying in the dark, the scent of her breath and the ache in his bones a constant reminder, Leo felt something inside him fracture. The obedient son, the terrified husband. The boy who hid his bruises, that persona cracked under the weight of the evening's savagery. A new, desperate resolve, cold and sharp, began to crystallize in the emptiness. He could not live like this for another night. The fear of what she might do if he failed was now eclipsed by the certainty of what she would do if he stayed. He waited until her snores were deep and regular, then slid from the bed with the silence of a ghost. The floorboards were icy under his bare feet. He knew where she kept her phone, tucked into the pocket of the jacket she always hung on the back of the kitchen chair. The house was a tomb, the only light a sliver of moon through the dirty window over the sink. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. He found the phone, its cold, smooth surface feeling like a lifeline. His hands shook so violently he nearly dropped it. He crept into the small, dank bathroom, locking the door behind him. Sitting on the closed lid of the toilet, he powered on the phone, the bright screen illuminating his tear-streaked face in the darkness. He typed the words he had seen on a poster at school. Child Abuse Hotline. The number appeared. Each digit he pressed was an act of rebellion that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He put the phone to his ear, listening to the ring, a sound that connected his private hell to the world of help and order. A woman's voice, calm and professional, answered. Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline? Can you tell me your name? The sound of another human being, a normal voice from the normal world, was so overwhelming that Leo's throat clenched shut. He tried to speak, to force his name out, but all that emerged was a strangled gasp. The woman asked again, her tone gentle, reassuring. But the reassurance couldn't penetrate the fear that roared back to life. What if they didn't believe him? What if they called Clara? What would she do to him then? The threat of her wrath, more immediate and vivid than the promise of salvation, seized him. A panicked sob escaped his lips, and with a fumbling, desperate motion, he stabbed the button to end the call. The line went dead. The silence in the bathroom was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing. He had held a key to his freedom in his hand and had thrown it away. Defeated, he returned the phone to the jacket pocket and slipped back into the hallway. But the fractured resolve within him had not completely vanished. It flickered, a dying ember seeking fuel. In his room, he found a stub of a pencil and a torn corner of paper from an old homework assignment. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he poured his desperation onto the page. The words were a messy scrawl, a child's plea etched in graphite. Asterisk, help me. My mom hurts me. She makes me do bad things. I'm scared. Asterisk. It was not eloquent, but it was the truth, the raw, unvarnished core of his agony. He couldn't keep it on him. Clara searched his things. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning for a hiding place she would never think to check. He went to the vent cover near the floor, its screws loose from age. With trembling fingers, he pried it open just enough to slip the folded note inside, letting it fall into the dark, dusty ductwork. It was a message in a bottle cast into a metal sea, a symbol of a hope that was too frail to act upon openly, but too tenacious to be entirely extinguished. As dawn began to tinge the sky with a pale, sickly gray, Leo stood at his window, looking out at the road that led away. The failed phone call and the hidden note were not enough. They were passive, waiting for someone else to act. The memory of his failed sprint into the field came back to him, but this time it was different. He wasn't running on pure, panicked instinct. He was making a decision. The breaking point had been reached, and the pieces of his old compliance lay shattered around him. A new, terrifying clarity settled over him. He could not wait for rescue. He could not hide notes and hope. He had to leave. Today. When the school bus came, he would get on it. But he would not come back. He would find a teacher, a policeman, anyone. The decision, once made, filled him not with joy, but with a cold, steady dread. It was the end of one terror and the beginning of another, but it was a path leading away from her, and that was the only direction that mattered anymore. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp earth and blooming honeysuckle, a pastoral tranquility that was a lie. From her kitchen window, Agnes Gable watched the boys' slow, pained progress down the dirt road. Leo was walking to the bus stop, his backpack looking like an unbearable weight on his slender frame. The distance was too great for fine details, but Mrs. Gable didn't need them. It was in the way he moved, a stiff, careful shuffle, as if his entire body was one massive bruise. Then, as he turned slightly to check for the bus, the angle of the rising sun caught his face, illuminating it with a cruel clarity. A dark, purplish bloom stained the delicate skin around his left eye, and a fresh, angry cut traced a path from his temple down his cheek. It was not the mark of a fall from a tree or a scrap with a friend. It was the signature of deliberate, targeted violence. The plausible lie Clara had spun about a neurological condition evaporated in that single, horrifying glimpse. This was not the result of an illness. This was evidence. The nagging unease that had plagued her for months solidified into a cold, certain dread. Her hand, holding her teacup, began to tremble, the china rattling against the saucer. She could not unsee it. She could not, in good conscience, do nothing. Setting the cup down with a decisive click, she moved with a purpose her aging body hadn't felt in years. She went to the small table by her sofa where an old phone book lay. Her fingers, knotted with arthritis, fumbled through the thin pages until she found the number for the county's Department of Social Services. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she dialed. The call was brief and hushed. She gave her name, the address, and a simple, stark statement. She was an elderly neighbor, and she had serious concerns for the welfare of a 12-year-old boy who was showing clear and repeated signs of physical abuse. She mentioned the mother's isolation and the boy's visible fear. She hung up feeling a mixture of relief and terror, her gaze fixed on the lonely house, waiting for the world to intervene. Inside that house, Clara was wiping down the kitchen counters with a frantic energy, her senses heightened. She had seen the old woman watching from her window, a silent, judgmental sentinel. A primal alarm bell was ringing in Clara's mind. When the sound of a car engine, unfamiliar and official, crunched on the gravel driveway, her body went rigid. Peering through the curtain, she saw a sedan and a woman in a crisp blouse getting out, a badge clipped to her belt. The system she had so carefully evaded was now on her porch. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She had minutes, seconds to construct a fortress of lies. By the time the knock came, Clara's face was a mask of weary, concerned motherhood. She opened the door with a sigh, her expression one of resigned frustration. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice laced with a practiced exhaustion. The social worker, a woman named Sarah with a kind but unyielding face, introduced herself. "I'm here for a routine wellness check on Leo," she said, her eyes already scanning the dim, cluttered room behind Clara. Of course," Clara said, stepping aside with a gesture that was meant to seem welcoming but effectively blocked the view of the hall leading to the bedrooms. He's just getting ready for school. It's been a very difficult morning. She launched into her performance, her voice dropping to a pained whisper. His condition, the doctors think it might be a form of episodic dyscontrol. He has these terrible fits in his sleep. Last night, he must have thrashed about, hit his face on the bedside table. I found him on the floor. It just breaks my heart. She dabbed at a non-existent tear. He gets so embarrassed, poor thing. He doesn't like to talk about it. Just then, Leo emerged from his room, frozen in the hallway like a deer in headlights. The sight of the stranger in the living room, the official badge, sent a jolt of pure, undiluted terror through him. This was it. The moment he had both dreaded and, in his most secret heart, hoped for. His eyes, wide with fear, darted from the social worker's face to his mother's. Clara's gaze locked onto his, and in it, he saw not a plea, but a command. A silent, ferocious promise of what would happen if he spoke a word of truth. "Leo, honey," Clara said, her voice sickly sweet, "this nice lady is just checking in. I was telling her about your accident last night." The social worker knelt slightly, trying to meet his eyes. "Hi, Leo. I'm Sarah. That looks like a nasty bump. Can you tell me what happened?" Leo's mouth was desert dry. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he felt dizzy. The words were there, poised on his tongue. Asterisk, she did it. She hurts me. Help me, asterisk, but Clara's presence was a physical force, a smothering weight that stole his breath and his courage. The threat of her retaliation, the memory of the previous night's violence, was more real, more immediate, than this stranger's offer of help. His hope, so fragile after the failed phone call and the hidden note, shattered into dust. He looked at the floor, his entire body trembling. I fell," he whispered, the lie tasting like ash. "Out of bed." Sarah studied him, her professional eyes missing nothing. The tremor in his hands, the way he refused to look at her, the palpable fear that radiated from him like heat from a stove. Her suspicion was a living thing in the room, a sharp, intelligent energy that Clara's smooth lies could not completely dispel. She asked a few more gentle questions about school, about friends, each met with a monosyllabic answer or a shrug from Leo. Clara hovered, filling the silences with more explanations, more medical jargon, a constant, buzzing interference. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah stood. She handed Clara a business card. "If you need any support services, or if Leo's condition changes, please don't hesitate to call." Her tone was neutral, but her eyes made one last, sweeping assessment of the gloomy, oppressive house and the terrified boy standing within it. She was unconvinced, but she was also bound by procedure. Without a statement from the child or incontrovertible proof, her hands were tied. The moment the door closed, the kindly mask fell from Clara's face, replaced by a look of cold triumph. She turned to Leo, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "You see?" she hissed. "You see what happens? They can't help you. No one can. It's just us." Leo didn't respond. He simply stood there, hollowed out, the sound of the social worker's car driving away echoing the departure of his last, best chance. The investigators were suspicious, but they were gone. He was still there, alone with her. The intervention had failed, leaving him more imprisoned than ever. The walls of his cage now reinforced by the devastating knowledge that even when help came knocking, he was too broken, too terrified, to let it in. The silence that settled over the house after the social worker's departure was more suffocating than any that had come before. It was a silence thick with Clara's smug victory and Leo's utter desolation. For 3 days, the atmosphere was electric with unspoken threats. Clara watched him with the unblinking focus of a hawk, her every word a subtle reminder of her power and his helplessness. Leo moved through his chores like an automaton, the hope that had flickered during the intervention now completely extinguished, replaced by a heavy certainty that this was his life, forever. The hidden note in the vent felt like a childish fantasy, a message from a boy who had briefly believed in rescue. The raid came with the shocking suddenness of a thunderclap on a clear day. It was early afternoon, and Leo was scrubbing the kitchen floor, the chemical tang of the cleaner stinging his nostrils. The first sign was the sound of multiple car engines, a low growl that quickly swelled into a presence outside the house. Then came the sharp, authoritative knock on the door, not the tentative rap of a social worker, but a firm, percussive demand that shook the flimsy wooden frame. Clara, who had been sewing in the living room, froze. Her needle hovered in midair. Her eyes darted to the window, and Leo saw the color drain from her face, the smug mask of control crumbling into raw, panicked fear. This was different. This was not a single woman with a notepad. This was a force. Before she could even stand, the door burst open. It wasn't kicked in, but opened with decisive authority by a uniformed police officer, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon. Behind him stood two more officers and the social worker, Sarah, her expression now grim and determined. They filled the small, cluttered space, their presence making the house feel even smaller and more shabby. "Clara Gable?" the lead officer said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We have a warrant to search the premises." He held up a document, the official seal a stark contrast to the chaos of the living room. Clara found her voice, a shrill, desperate thing. "What is the meaning of this? You can't just barge in here. This is my home." She moved to block the hallway, her body a futile barricade against the tide of authority. But the officers were already moving, their movements efficient and practiced. One gently but firmly guided Clara aside, while the others began their methodical invasion. Leo remained on his knees on the wet floor, a forgotten specter in the sudden storm. He watched, his heart a wild, trapped bird in his chest, as they moved through his prison, opening drawers, looking under furniture. They were looking for something. Proof. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of terror and a faint, impossible glimmer of hope. He saw an officer enter his bedroom. Time seemed to slow. He thought of the note, the desperate graphite scrawl hidden in the dark, metallic throat of the vent. It was a foolish secret, a wish made on a star. They would never find it. They would leave, and the punishment that would follow would be biblical. But then the officer emerged from the bedroom. He wasn't empty-handed. He held a small, folded piece of paper between his gloved fingers. He nodded to the lead officer and to Sarah. Leo's breath hitched. They had found it. They had unscrewed the vent cover and reached into the darkness he had chosen. The lead officer unfolded the note. His eyes scanned the few, devastating words. When he looked up, his gaze went first to Clara, whose face was a rigid mask of fury and fear, and then it settled on Leo, still kneeling on the floor. The officer's expression changed. The professional detachment softened into something else. A profound, grim pity. "Leo," Sarah said, her voice calm and incredibly gentle. She stepped toward him, deliberately placing her body between him and his mother. "We're going to go outside now, okay? You're safe." Those two words, asterisk you're safe asterisk, were so alien, so unimaginable, that they didn't register as language. They were just sounds. But the meaning seeped in as two officers moved to flank Clara, their postures making it clear she was not to approach him. The physical separation was a tangible, shocking reality. The invisible chain that had bound him to her for so long was being severed before his eyes. He allowed Sarah to guide him to his feet. His legs felt boneless. He didn't look back at Clara as he was led out of the house, into the shocking brightness of the afternoon sun. The fresh air felt like a slap, a cleansing burn. He was placed in the back seat of a police car, not as a prisoner but as a protected witness. Through the window, he watched the continued activity. Officers carrying out boxes of evidence, the dark shape of Clara being led to a separate vehicle. The world outside the car window was a blur of blue uniforms and flashing lights, a chaotic ballet of intervention. He was safe. The truth, hidden in the attic, whispered in the neighbor's suspicions, and finally scribbled on a hidden note, had surfaced. The raid was not an end, but a violent, necessary beginning. It was the turning point, the moment the fortress of lies was breached, and the long, painful process of unraveling the nightmare could finally begin. As the car door closed, sealing him in a quiet, safe space, Leo leaned his head against the cool glass and finally, for the first time, wept tears that were not of despair, but of a stunned, overwhelming release. The truth, once it began to escape, did not trickle out but poured forth in a torrent of cold, clinical facts, each one more damning than the last. In the sterile, brightly lit offices of the Child Protective Services and the County Sheriff's Department, the story of Clara Gable was being reassembled from the fragments she had spent a lifetime burying. The search warrant executed during the raid had unlocked more than just a frightened boy's note. It had unlocked filing cabinets, a rusted strongbox, and the sealed records of a past Clara had meticulously walled off from the world. The investigation, now armed with Leo's testimony and the suspicious evidence of his injuries, began to dig, and the earth gave up its secrets with grim reluctance. The key was an old birth certificate, found pressed between the pages of a disintegrating family Bible. It listed Clara's father not as a name, but as unknown. This single detail was a thread, and when the investigators pulled it, the entire tapestry of a generational curse unraveled. Cross-referencing with records from a closed state asylum and files from a neighboring county's social services from 40 years prior, a horrifying pattern emerged. Clara had not been raised by strangers or in a foster home, as she had always claimed. She had been raised in near-total isolation by her own father, a man named Elias Gable, on the same dilapidated property where she now held Leo captive. The reports, written in the dry, bureaucratic language of another era, told a story that was a chilling mirror of Leo's own. They described a reclusive man and his young daughter, with teachers noting the girl's withdrawn nature, her flinching at sudden movements, and her possession of gifts and money far beyond the family's obvious means. Gifts that suspicious caseworkers suspected were payments for silence. There were documented visits, concerns raised, but like Leo, the young Clara had been too terrified to speak, and the system, overburdened and constrained by the standards of the time, had ultimately failed her. Elias Gable had died when Clara was 17, leaving her alone in the house, the sole inheritor of a property that was less a home and more a crime scene. The cycle had not been broken. It had been handed down, like a poisoned heirloom. Leo learned the full, crushing weight of this history not in a courtroom or a police station, but in the softly lit, beige-toned safety of a therapist's office. His new foster parents, a quiet, kind-eyed couple named Mark and Susan, sat with him during the first sessions, a solid, reassuring presence on the couch beside him. Dr. Evans, the therapist, had a voice that was calm and even, a river smoothing over sharp rocks. She explained things to him not as a detective would with facts and evidence, but as a storyteller piecing together a tragedy. She told him about his grandfather, Elias. She told him about the isolation, the control, the abuse that his mother had endured, a childhood stripped of safety and love, warped into a template for the one she would later inflict upon him. She used the word cycle, and Leo understood it viscerally. It was not an abstract concept. It was the familiar creak of the porch steps, the same pattern on the faded kitchen linoleum, the same terrifying look in a parent's eyes. The horror he had lived was not an original creation. It was a replica. He was not the first child to have his childhood murdered in that house. The knowledge landed not with a scream, but with a profound, silent hollowing out. He had spent so long believing his mother was a monster, a unique and evil aberration. To learn that she was also a victim, that her monstrousness was a learned behavior, a symptom of a sickness passed from one generation to the next, was a confusion more painful than anger. The man in the attic photograph, the ghost with his own eyes, was not just a relative. He was the author of all their misery. The generational curse was no longer a vague suspicion. It was a documented fact, a chain of trauma linking him to his mother and to a grandfather he would never meet. He grappled with a torrent of conflicting emotions. There was a flicker of pity for the girl Clara had been, a child trapped just as he had been. But it was quickly extinguished by the roaring memory of her hands on him, her voice in his ear, the specific, personal cruelty of the abuse she had chosen to perpetuate. The theme of inherited trauma was no longer a theme. It was the very air he breathed. It was in his DNA, in the walls of the house that haunted his dreams, in the familiar shape of his own face in the mirror. He had escaped the physical prison, but the psychological one, built by the sins of the father and the mother, felt infinitely more complex. The past had been unraveled, but the threads were now tangled around him, a web of pain and history that he would spend a lifetime trying to understand and, perhaps, one day, escape. The truth, once it escaped the confines of police reports and court documents, did not simply travel. It exploded, a dirty bomb of sensational horror detonated across the 24-hour news cycle. It began as a whisper on a local news blog, a cryptic mention of an ongoing, deeply disturbing child welfare case in a rural county. But within hours, the whisper became a roar. An unnamed source, a clerk or a deputy with a loose tongue and a taste for infamy, leaked the bare, brutal bones of the story. The details were fragmentary but potent enough. A boy, a mother, a house of horrors, a history of unspeakable acts stretching back generations. It was a recipe for a national firestorm, and the media fed it with an insatiable hunger. The headline, splashed across a notorious tabloid website, was the spark that ignited the blaze. Mother's incestuous marriage to son. The most disturbing case in USA history? The question mark was a formality. The declaration was the point. Other outlets, from cable news networks to respectable broadsheets, quickly adopted the framing, their own headlines dripping with a mixture of outrage and prurient fascination. The story was too grotesque, too perfectly shocking, to resist. It was no longer about a child named Leo. It was about a national spectacle, a modern-day Gothic tragedy served up for public consumption. For Leo, the storm broke just as he was beginning to grasp the fragile concept of safety. He was living in a small, clean room in the home of his foster parents, Mark and Susan. The walls were painted a soft blue, and a bookshelf held stories of adventure and magic, worlds away from his own. The quiet routine of meals, of gentle questions, of a bed that was his alone, was still a foreign language he was struggling to learn. Then, one evening, Mark quietly turned off the television during the nightly news. Susan's face was pale. Later, Leo saw the newspaper on the kitchen table, folded to hide the front page, but he caught a glimpse of the words Gable Case and a grainy, years-old photo of his mother's house. The outside world had found him. The exposure was a new form of violation. He wasn't allowed to go to school. Administrators feared a media frenzy. Instead, a tutor came to the house, but even she looked at him with a poorly concealed mix of pity and morbid curiosity. Once, on a necessary trip to a therapist's appointment, a reporter with a camera lunged toward their car as they pulled out of the driveway, shouting questions that were muffled by the glass but whose intent was clear. Leo flinched back into the seat, his heart racing, the feeling of being hunted returning with nauseating force. He was a specimen under a microscope, his trauma dissected and displayed for millions. The public outrage was a distant, abstract roar, but its effects were concrete. The loss of anonymity, the stares from strangers in the grocery store, the constant low-grade hum of anxiety that the next headline would reveal some new, intimate detail of his suffering. The scrutiny amplified his trauma, layering a new kind of fear atop the old. The nightmares, which had begun to recede slightly in the calm of his new environment, returned with a vengeance. Now, they were not just about Clara's hands or the dark of the bedroom, but about cameras flashing in his eyes, microphones shoved in his face, a sea of strangers pointing and whispering. He felt exposed, stripped bare not just for his abuser but for the entire world. The justice system was moving, Clara was in jail awaiting trial, but he felt no sense of victory. He felt like a shipwreck survivor who had been pulled from the ocean only to be put on display in a museum of calamities. The foster home, his sanctuary, began to feel like another gilded cage. He watched Mark and Susan field calls from lawyers and victim advocates, their kind faces etched with worry. He knew they were protecting him, but the very act of protection was a constant reminder of the storm raging outside. He would sit by his window, not looking at the overgrown field of his past, but at the quiet, suburban street of his present, wondering if the car slowing down at the curb contained a neighbor or a journalist. The trauma of the abuse was now intertwined with the trauma of the spectacle. He had been rescued from one prison, only to find himself trapped in the blinding, unforgiving spotlight of a world that saw him not as a boy, but as the central figure in the most disturbing case in USA history. The path to healing, already steep and fraught, was now lined with the cameras and judgments of a public that could never truly understand the silence he had endured. The courtroom was a cavern of polished wood and solemn silence, a world away from the dusty, whispered horrors of the house at the end of the road. For Leo, sitting on the hard, wooden bench between a victim's advocate and his foster father, Mark, the air itself felt heavy with judgment, thick with the collective breath of the spectators packed into the gallery. He kept his eyes fixed on the grain of the table in front of him, tracing the lines as if they were a map that could lead him out of this moment. He could feel the weight of hundreds of stares on the back of his neck, a prickle of exposure that was almost as violating as the touches he was here to describe. The air conditioning hummed, a cold, artificial chill that seeped through his new, stiff clothes bought for him by Susan, clothes that didn't smell like home. Then a side door opened, and a hush fell, deeper and more profound than before. He didn't need to look up to know she had entered. He felt her presence like a shift in atmospheric pressure, a familiar dread that coiled in his stomach. Against his will, his eyes were drawn upward. There she was, Clara. She was wearing a simple, dark dress, her hair neatly styled, but the careful facade couldn't conceal the hardness in her eyes or the defiant set of her jaw. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the formal setting, yet her gaze, when it swept across the room and briefly met his, was the same possessive, chilling stare that had held him captive for years. It was a look that said, "You are mine." He quickly looked down again, his heart hammering, the map on the table blurring. When it was his turn to testify, the walk to the witness stand felt like the longest journey of his life. The wooden chair was like an island in the center of the room. The judge, an elderly man with a kind, weary face, instructed him to tell the truth. The prosecutor, a woman with a gentle voice named Ms. Rivera, began with soft, easy questions, building a foundation of normalcy that already felt like a lie. Then she guided him gently toward the edge of the abyss. "Leo," she said, her voice calm and steady, "can you tell us about the nights you spent in your mother's room?" The words stuck in his throat. The sterile, bright room seemed to recede, replaced by the oppressive darkness of the bedroom, the smell of whiskey and perfume, the feel of rough sheets against his skin. He could feel Clara's eyes burning into him, a silent command to stay silent, to protect their secret. But the advocate had told him to look at Ms. Rivera, to focus on her face. He clung to that anchor, his voice a thin, reedy whisper as he began to speak. He described the forced intimacy, the twisted rituals, the pet names that felt like acid on his tongue. He did not cry. The tears had been burned out of him long ago. Instead, he delivered his testimony with a flat, horrifying monotony, each detail a stark, unadorned fact laid bare under the fluorescent lights. The harrowing scene was not in his delivery, but in the stark contrast between the clinical setting and the grotesque reality of the acts he described. A juror gasped softly. Another looked away, unable to bear the unflinching gaze of a child recounting his own destruction. Throughout it all, Clara's expression never changed. She stared at him, not with remorse or shame, but with a cold, analytical detachment, as if he were a faulty appliance that had betrayed her. Her lawyer cross-examined him, trying to poke holes in his story, suggesting confusion, implying that his troubled mind had fabricated these tales. But Leo's story was too consistent, the details too specific and too awful to be invented. The truth, once spoken, had a terrible weight that crushed the lawyer's feeble insinuations. The conviction came quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. His testimony, the medical records, the historical files, the note from the vent. When the foreman read the verdict, "Guilty," on all counts, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clara remained impassive, as if the word had nothing to do with her. Leo expected to feel something: triumph, relief, justice. But as he was led from the stand, All he felt was a vast, hollow emptiness. The legal aftermath was complete. The system had worked. She would be taken away for a long, long time. But as he walked out of the courtroom, past the reporters who were already scrambling to broadcast the outcome, the hollowness yawned wider inside him. The cost of truth-telling was his entire history, laid bare and dissected for strangers. His mother was gone, but so was the last vestige of the boy he had been before the abuse. The victory felt like ash. He had told the truth, and the truth had set no one free. It had only carved him out, leaving a shell where a boy used to be. The gavel's bang had not been an end, but an echo of a silence that now felt permanent. He was safe, according to the law, but he felt more alone than ever, the weight of his story a life sentence of its own. Therapy was a different kind of silence. It was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of the old house, but a sterile, intentional hush, broken only by the soft tick of a clock on the wall and the measured breath of Dr. Evans. For Leo, the beige room with its comfortable chairs and box of tissues felt like a foreign planet. The expectation to speak, to excavate the rot he had spent years burying, was a terror more nuanced than any he had faced before. In this room, the monster was not Clara. It was the memory of her, a ghost that lived in the scar tissue of his mind. The struggle was internal now, a daily battle against the reflexes of fear and the distorted self-perception she had carved into him. PTSD was not a word he would have chosen, but the symptoms were a familiar language. The way a raised voice in the school cafeteria could send him into a cold sweat, the nightmares that left him gasping in the safety of his new bed, the visceral recoil from a casual, friendly touch. His identity was a shattered mirror, and he no longer knew how to piece the fragments together. Was he a victim? A survivor? A son? A husband? The labels swirled in his head, each one feeling like an ill-fitting costume. The abuse had not just stolen his childhood. It had poisoned the very well of his selfhood. He would look at other boys his age, with their easy laughter and uncomplicated worries, and feel like an imposter, a creature from a darker world masquerading in a child's skin. In sessions, Dr. Evans would gently guide him toward recognizing his own feelings, his own desires, separate from Clara's demands. It was agonizing work, like learning to walk on legs that had been broken for too long. A turning point of sorts came when he was invited to join a small group for young survivors of trauma. The first meeting was paralyzing. He sat in a circle of folding chairs in a sunlit community center room, his hands clenched in his lap, unable to meet anyone's eyes. But as the others began to share, a girl who flinched at slamming doors, a boy who had a panic attack in a crowded mall, he heard echoes of his own internal chaos. Their stories were different in the details, but the emotional landscape was hauntingly familiar. The shame, the hypervigilance, the feeling of being permanently marked. He did not speak that day, but he listened. In their shared silence and their halting words, he found a solace he had never known. It was the solace of not being alone in the wreckage. Yet this solace was double-edged. Hearing their struggles also forced him to confront the long, arduous road that lay ahead. Recovery was not a destination he would reach after a few therapy sessions. It was a lifelong journey of managing triggers, rebuilding trust, and learning to inhabit a body that felt like a crime scene. One boy in the group, a few years older, spoke of still waking up screaming years after being removed from his abusive home. The glimmer of resilience Leo had begun to feel flickered, threatened by the stark reality of enduring scars. The darkness of his past was not a room he could simply exit and lock behind him. It was a shadow that would walk with him, sometimes falling behind, sometimes stretching long before him in the afternoon sun. The session ended with a simple exercise, naming one small thing they looked forward to in the coming week. When his turn came, Leo's mind went blank. All he could see was the long, gray road of the future. But then he thought of Mark and Susan, of the way Susan always made his favorite pancakes on Saturday mornings without being asked. He thought of the patient silence they offered him, a silence that asked for nothing in return. "Pancakes," he whispered, the word barely audible. Dr. Evans smiled softly. "That's a good thing to look forward to." It was a tiny thing, a mundane detail, but as he said it, Leo felt a shift. It was not a dramatic healing, not a victory over the darkness. It was a single, stubborn point of light, a glimmer of resilience amid the overwhelming shadows. It was the understanding that the road ahead was long, but that it might also contain small, ordinary moments of peace. He had spent so long surviving that he had forgotten what it was to anticipate, to want something simple and good. As he left the room, the shadow was still there, but for the first time, he felt that he might, one day, learn to walk alongside it instead of being consumed by it. Time did not heal the wound. It simply scarred over, leaving a thick, numb tissue where the raw nerve of his childhood used to be. Leo stood at the window of his small apartment, watching the city lights begin to prick the evening sky. He was a young adult now, his frame filled out, the boyish softness of his face hardened into angles. But the eyes that looked out at the world were the same ones that had witnessed the unspeakable, older now, layered with a permanent weariness. The legal victory, the therapy, the slow, painstaking construction of a functional life, they were all facts, achievements logged on a case file. But the case's impact was not in the facts. It was in the echoes, the silent reverberations that shaped his every breath, his every hesitant connection. He rarely thought of the house anymore, or of the media storm that had briefly made him a spectacle. Those memories were like photographs in a book he had closed long ago. But the psychological architecture of his life had been built upon the foundation of that trauma. Trust was not a given but a calculus of risk and potential pain. Intimacy was a minefield, the ghost of Clara's touch causing him to flinch from a lover's casual caress. He functioned, he worked, he even laughed on occasion, but the laughter always felt like it came from a room adjacent to his true self, a performance of normalcy for a world that could never understand the silence at his core. The decision to visit her was not born of a desire for closure or reconciliation. Closure was a myth sold by self-help books. It was more of a morbid compulsion, a need to face the ghost in its current cage, to see if the monster of his memory had been diminished by bars and time. The drive to the women's correctional facility was long and silent, the hum of the car engine the only sound. He parked in a lot surrounded by coiled razor wire gleaming in the sun, a stark monument to consequence. The visiting room was a study in controlled sterility. Linoleum floors, plastic chairs bolted to the ground, the air smelling of disinfectant and despair. He sat at a small table, his hands folded, waiting. When they brought her in, the sight of her was a physical shock. The years had not been kind. Clara's hair was streaked with gray, pulled back in a severe bun. The defiant pride that had once held her spine rigid was gone, replaced by a sallow, institutionalized slump. She was smaller, diminished, a papery version of the woman who had once been his entire world and his personal hell. She sat down across from him, her eyes, his eyes, meeting his with a flat, unnerving calm. There was no greeting, no pretense. The silence between them was a living entity, thick with all the words that had never been spoken and all the ones that had been screamed. Leo searched her face for a flicker of anything, remorse, regret, even a glimmer of the mother she might have once been before her own history broke her. He found nothing. Her gaze was empty, a boarded-up window looking in on a vacant lot. He did not ask her why. He did not tell her about his life. There was no point. Instead, he simply said, "I survived you." It was not a boast, but a statement of bleak fact. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a cold, reptilian twitch that held no warmth. "You were always a strong boy," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. It was not an apology. It was an assessment, a comment on a piece of property that had proven durable. She showed no remorse. There was no crack in her armor, no moment of human breakdown. The tragedy was not that she was a monster. It was that she was still, unequivocally, the same woman. The prison had contained her body, but her mind remained in the twisted, isolated universe she had created. A universe where her actions were justified, even sacred. The visit cemented the absolute nature of the tragedy. There was no redemption arc, no last-minute understanding. There was only the unchangeable past and the permanent damage it had wrought. The drive home was bleaker than the drive there. The confrontation had not provided catharsis. It had only confirmed his deepest fear, that the scars were not just on him, but on the very fabric of what should have been a sacred bond. The abuse had not been a temporary madness but the core expression of who she was. As he navigated the traffic back to his apartment, the unresolved pain settled over him like a familiar coat. It was a dull, constant ache, the echo of a silence that had begun in a decrepit house and would now follow him for the rest of his days. The chapter on Clara Gable was closed by the state, but for Leo, it would always be an open wound, a haunting reminder of the love that was never given and the childhood that was stolen. Its lasting scars a testament to a silence that would never truly be broken.